Good evening. My name is Beth Webb. I'm an author and a storyteller. And this evening I'm going to do The Fall of the House of Usher. I have called it Why the House of Usher Fell because I'm not an actress. I haven't learned the story off by heart and I'm not reading it. So storytellers tend to take an idea for a story and then absorb it and then reinterpret it and tell it according to the audience. It's never quite the same as you might have seen written down in the book. The other thing about tonight's telling of the story is that I've explored some of the aspects of the story a little bit deeper than it comes over in the book. I think the difference between when the story was published first in 1839 in the Burton's Gentleman's Magazine in America, and the difference between that and now is in those days somebody would have had a story and would have had the time to sit and think about it, to meditate on it, and to actually pull things together to create an idea. But now, especially an event like this evening, it comes and it goes, it's quick. The ideas have to be presented clearly. That ideas often, which are hidden within the text, are a little more difficult to understand when they come quickly through a video, through a film, or through a telling like this evening. So you won't find it exactly the same as any collection of Poe's stories. But tonight, welcome, if you dare, to my telling of Why the House of Usher Fell, based closely on Edgar Allen Poe's remarkable story, The Fall of the House of Usher. I had journeyed all day through a dank, desolate landscape. The sky felt uncomfortably low. The air was close and still. Despite the chill of that autumn afternoon, I felt I could hardly breathe. I was tired. I had been riding for many hours when at last I came to my destination, the home of my old friend Roderick Usher. A low, grey-brown building that squatted on an island in the middle of a dark tarn. Heavy, thickly built, looking for all the world like a malicious, malignant toad, hating everything around it. I shuddered. I contemplated even turning round and going back, but it was so late in the afternoon I could not reach an inn before nightfall. And I could not let my friend Roderick Usher down, for he had just recently written to me begging me to visit him, for he was very ill both in body and in mind. He said that the cheerfulness of my conversation and my company would do much to alleviate his condition. I could not turn him down. We had been friends since childhood, although I had never been to his house before. But as I drew closer to this heavy, ugly building, I began to put two and two together, for although Roderick and I had been close at school, even intimate, I realized that I had never really known him. He had been a close person, kept himself to himself. And now I saw the house, I wondered if a childhood in such a building had made him into who he was, or if the house had been formed by the family of Usher. Were they all like Roderick, slightly distant and cold? At school he had always joked that, as he and his sister were the last of the line once his father died, that he was, in the old-fashioned sense, all there was of the House of Usher. I urged my horse closer. The sun was getting low in the sky, making the house look even more forbidding and unwelcoming. And I thought I needed to be logical. I would look at the house from another angle and then perhaps see it more clearly, for I could not make out any sense of poetry or beauty in its lines. I took my horse to the precipitous edge of a deep, dark tarn that surrounded the building, and tried to take it in, piece by piece, logically. The tarn itself would possibly once have been a magnificent lake. There had once been gardens, but these were just filled with dry sedges and dead trees, white in the low sunlight, their branches stretching up to the sky and their twigs seeming to scratch at the clouds. It was strange, so dead, so lifeless. How could Roderick live here? I thought maybe if I looked at the house from another angle, I could be more logical about it. I took my horse even closer so that I could look down into the tarn and see the building reflected in it, for often a new vista changes one's perspective. And then my heart's blood ran cold, for what had seemed like an ungainly, heavy pile of grey and brown stone, now that I saw it upside down, was for all the world bone-coloured and like a huge misshapen skull. The narrow lancet windows now looked like empty eye sockets, and from them something was watching me. And the great dark archway that covered the gate was now a yawning maw, a great open skull mouth. Oh, I was tired, that was all. I turned my horse to cross the causeway that spanned the tarn. As I came closer, I determined to be logical. I looked up at the building. I assessed its architecture, the manner in which the heavy square stones had been laid one upon the other. The buttresses were thick with green moss, and from under the eaves lichens hung down soft and loose like decayed grave clothes, and the narrow windows that seemed like eye sockets were even more menacing the closer I got. But the building seemed solid enough, ancient, weathered. There was only one fault I could see, and that was a narrow, barely perceptible crack that zigzagged down, left and right, right and left, all the way from under the roof, all the way into the dark waters of the tarn. But that was only a minor crack. And then the gates opened. A servant was waiting for me. I looked over my shoulder for one last glance over the black waters, which seemed like polished obsidian, one of those dark mirrors that soothsayers use when they pretend to foretell the future. And from out of that black water, as if a vicious, poisonous exhalation, grey shadows seemed to rise, a sort of dancing mist. And in the low light, this mist seemed to be almost luminous. I turned away from it. I greeted the servant who took my horse and my bags. I dismounted and then crossed the courtyard where a valet stood by an open door. He welcomed me in and informed me that the master was waiting in his studio. He led me along dark, endless corridors. The floors were made of polished black marble, and the walls hung with heavy arras. These had once been bright with colour and joyful myths and legends, but the moss and the dust had had their way, and now there were just greying shards of hanging rotten wool. The ceiling of these passageways was arched vaults, and in them were carved grotesque faces. I didn't like it at all. We walked on past suits of armour which displayed the valour of those who had once worn them, and these rattled slightly in the air as we stirred it as we passed through. Why was I so unnerved by this place? For my own childhood home was very similar. I had skated along the marble floors, I had hidden behind the tapestries, and I had pretended to be a knight, hiding behind the armour, ready to leap out on dragons and demons alike. I had made faces at the grotesques carved in the ceilings. It had been fun. But why was this so unnerving? On the way up a staircase, we passed a man who the valet informed me was the family doctor. He had a sort of uneasy, slightly scheming look upon his face. I didn't like him, but he left quickly, and the valet led me at last to a landing and a carved oak door. He knocked and opened it. I stepped inside. The room was very dark, although the sun had not yet fully set. I looked around. It was huge and cavernous, more a hall than a studio. Those narrow windows I had seen from outside were thickly set with crimson glass, and what light eased through slid and fell upon the floor and pooled like blood-coloured light on the black boards. In the hearth a fire burned, but it gave little warmth or cheer to the room. But in its meagre light I looked around and saw old-fashioned furniture, black and heavily carved, and here and there were musical instruments and books left. A sight that would normally give me pleasure, for I loved both, but these seemed to have the feeling of being abandoned, cast aside, as if too heavy. They could not be finished, they could not be held. I moved closer to the fire, and from the sofa a shadowy figure rose. A voice greeted me with great warmth and enthusiasm. I looked closer. Could this be my friend Roderick? I could not tell. In the light of the fire, I saw that once had been thick blonde hair was now cobwebby, and it moved and wafted in the air. But there was the fine arched brows, the strong nose, the rounded sensuous lips, and the weak chin. And there was the voice of my friend, so changed, although it had only been a few years since we had met last. He begged me sit. He ordered supper for me, and while I ate, he told me of the malaise that afflicted him. It is a family illness, he said. Hopefully it will pass off very soon. I asked him what it was, and he explained that it was a sort of enhancement of the senses. Everything seemed bigger and stronger and louder than it should be. He said that the scent of roses made him feel nauseous. He could not bear light. His clothes had to be made of silk or linen, otherwise they scraped at his skin and tore it from his flesh until he bled. He could only eat the most insipid of food and drink water. He could not taste wine. Music, which he had once loved, now he could only bear slightest sound of a very softly played stringed instrument. But his whole soul seemed to be shrivelling and fading away. And then he told me something which I thought maybe explained it. His sister, His sister Madeline, whom I had heard of but never met, was also ill, and it was she that the doctor had been visiting, for she had a sort of wasting illness. Whatever she ate or drank, nothing seemed to agree with her, and she was just fading away. The doctors had no idea what was wrong. They had tried potions and draughts and pills, but nothing helped. And it was her illness that was dragging him down. For, he said, fear that although she gets up every day and goes about her duties and tries to do what she can, that one day soon will be her last. And when she dies, I don't know what I'll do. And then at that very moment, a door opened at one side of the hall, and a frail female figure walked across almost silently, without acknowledging either of us, and then left through another door. Roderick looked at me and said, "That is she, but I fear you will never see her again." And then I said, well, maybe it is her illness which is dragging you down and making you ill. Maybe when whatever illness she has taken its toll, you will have a chance to recover. Then Roderick said something very strange. He leaned close and he said, "No, I have not been entirely honest with you, for, my friend, I am also dying. I will not outlive Madeline for long. My time is almost up. For you see, the house is sentient. This building, which has housed the House of Usher for so many centuries, it loathes us." "What do you mean the house is sentient?" I asked, although in my heart I had a sympathy for what he was saying, for what I had witnessed earlier. I almost believed him, although it made no sense whatsoever. And Roderick said, "There is something about the way the stones have been put together. There is something about the house that is wrong. And believe me, I do not say it lightly, but it is sentient. It is determined to crush us. The house of stone wishes to crush and destroy the house of flesh. There is no hope. When Madeline dies, I will follow soon." And then he looked around furtively, as if afraid he was being overheard. And he said, "Listen, it is worse than the house being sentient and the house loathing us." "How do you mean?" I asked. "Well," he said, "there is folklore hereabouts that once long ago this hillside was green and beautiful, and the dark, dank tarn was once a bright, clear lake with an island in the middle, and on it there were enacted ancient pagan rituals, and the demons who were once worshipped here hate and resent us for having built their house on their sacred site. Things will come to an end soon, I promise you." I did not know what to say, but I went to bed determined that I would do what I could to ease my friend's malaise. The following day, I bought out books and musical instruments. I talked to Roderick. I tried to get him interested in poetry, in stories, in song. We did our best. We remembered all the poems we had loved as children, and we even wrote a few of our own. And then he picked up his guitar, a small, lightly strung instrument, which seemed to play with such expression. I can only say he could make that instrument speak. It seemed to tell of the agony of his spirit. I have never heard music like it. It seemed to portray everything that was going on in his heart and soul. It broke my own heart to listen to it. And then one day he wanted to paint. I was attempting sunsets and bowls of flowers, things to cheer him up. But he drew something abstract and so strange it is burned in my memory. It was a long corridor, and something about it, but I don't know what, gave me the intimation that it was deep underground and narrow. There was no ornament, no windows, no doors. There were no lanterns and no torches. It was painted a blazing white, and it had a searing light which searched your soul when you looked at it. And I thought, if this is what Roderick feels inside, he has all my sympathy. It was such a painful light, and there was no escaping it. And another day he decided he wanted to sing. He sang some songs we both knew, and then he started extemporizing, making up a song, a new one that I had never heard before. It was a strange tale with a sort of dirge-like melody about a king who lived in a green, good land, and he was a good man. The people loved him and he cared for them. But then one day an unnamed evil slithered across the land, bringing plague and desolation everywhere it went. Crops failed, trees and fruit withered and rotted. And this thing, this evil, slithered into the castle itself and right into the heart of the king. And he too withered like a rotten fruit. He sank into himself until there was just living, walking bones. And if you looked in through the castle windows, you would just see two red eyes peering out. I did not like the tale, but I congratulated Roderick on the skill of its composition. He laid aside his guitar and he said, "That song is important to me, for it is the tale of the House of Usher. Once this land was green, as I have told you, and once we were loved and we worked hard. The family of Usher were poets and painters, philanthropists. But whether it's the weight of the bricks or the demons who once were worshipped on the island, whether it is just some unnamed hatred, the House of Usher is falling. We don't have long to live." There was nothing else I could say. After supper, we went to our chambers, both feeling hollow and empty inside. The following day I resumed my duties of trying to cheer Roderick along, but he seemed distracted until at last he said, "My sister Madeline died last night." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "When will the funeral be, and may I come?" He looked thoughtful for a long moment, and he said, "There will be no funeral, not for a while." "How come?" "Well," he said, "the doctor you saw on the stair is very intrigued by my sister's illness, and there will be others like him, men who wish to analyze and understand, and although I am sympathetic to medical science, I do not wish Madeline's corpse to be dissected. And so my plan is to take her down into the cellars below this house. They are deep and dark and cold. Her body will come to no harm for a week or two down there. And then, when the doctors have lost interest, then we will take her far away and bury her in a distant graveyard where no one will know who she is, and grave robbers will have no interest in her." And then Roderick said, "Would you do me the honour of helping me in coffin my sister?" I had to agree, although I dreaded the thought. We went up the stairs to her chamber, which was very similar to my own, a room with tall, narrow windows and tapestries on the walls and a heavy oak bed. Roderick pulled back the curtains, and there on the bed lay the Lady Madeline. She was as pale as ivory, and dressed in a white linen shift, and her thin hands folded over her breast. We picked her up between us, and rigour had not yet set in, and we laid her in a makeshift coffin. We put on a lid loosely, and lifted it, and carried it down the main staircase, where a servant met us carrying a torch. He led us to the back of the house and down long, dark, winding staircases, until, to my calculations, we were almost directly under my own room, but many floors below. And Roderick explained that this part of the building had once been used for the worst of medieval excesses, of torture and of imprisonment, but in later years just for storage. We stopped in a narrow, dark corridor. Roderick pointed to a door, ironclad. "We will use this cellar," he said. "It was once used for storing gunpowder. It is copper-lined, and the door is clad in iron. She will come to no harm in there." We laid down the coffin. The servant held the torch while we pulled and dragged the door open. It screeched and ground over the stone, sending sparks into the darkness. At last it stood wide, and there was an empty, black nothingness beyond. The servant went in first and put the torch into a sconce. There was so little air in there, the flame gutted and almost faded. We picked up the coffin and put it on trestles set inside. The servant left, and Roderick took off the lid, wishing to say goodbye to his sister one last time. I remarked on how alike they were, and he said yes, we were twins. We had one mind and one soul. We loved each other deeply. We often knew what each other was thinking before either had spoken. She was my other half, and I loved her more than I can tell. And rigour must have started to set in, for there was a sort of pulled smile on her face. And the dancing light of the torch, with its red and golden glow, gave the mockery of a blush on her cheek and on her breast. Roderick said a prayer, and we screwed on the lid tightly. Together, taking the torch, we shouldered the door shut again with screeching, grinding noises. We climbed the stair, and as there was nothing more to do or say, we retired to our rooms early. The following day, Roderick was not himself. He seemed distracted and uneasy. He wandered around the house from room to room, looking around and sort of listening, and then muttering to himself and wiping his brow with a kerchief. And I wondered if maybe something was on his mind, something troubled his conscience. I asked him if he needed to see a priest, and he shook his head and said, "No, it's too late for that," which seemed a strange thing to say. But day after day I accompanied him every waking moment, lest he miss a step or get distracted and get lost in a lonely corridor or come to harm. I went with him for every hour, day after day, until 4 or 5 days after Madeleine had died, a terrible storm blew up. And once again Roderick and I decided to retire to our rooms early, and I was glad to be on my own, for I was finding Roderick's grief and anguish hard to bear. I sat by the fire, and I could not read for the lashing of the storm. The wind howled, the shutters on the windows rattled. There seemed to be 1,000 demons flinging themselves at the windows and at the roof and the walls, slamming and banging and crashing. I shuddered and made up the fire. The night went on. I could not sleep. I could not read. I just listened. It seemed as if all the grief in the world was flinging itself at the house. And then, in the early hours, my shutter came loose from its clasp and began to bang, bang, open and shut, bang, 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 bang. I got up and opened the window. And there, on the tarn below, there was writhing, ghostly shapes, those exhalations of the water that I had noticed on my first day, and they were luminous. There seemed to be dancing, some strange, beckoning, writhing dance. I shuddered and was about to pull the shutter closed when suddenly my door opened. I looked around and there was Roderick, wearing a nightshirt and a grey shawl pulled around his shoulders. He stood there shivering, and when he saw I was at the window, and he ran, and he pushed me aside, and he leaned out, and he pointed with a shaking hand at the writhing, ghostly shapes, and he said, "You have seen them too. I knew you would. There they are. Look, just like I said." I pulled him aside gently and said, "It's just marsh gas, Roderick. And maybe the light is a reflection of far-off lightning. It's all natural things, nothing to worry about. Come and sit by the fire." I pulled the shutter shut and locked it, and pulled the window over and fastened it tightly. I led him to the chair by the fire and sat opposite him. He was wringing his hands and staring around distractedly. I said, "Come, I will read to you. This is one of your favourite romances." And I picked up a book at random. I had no idea if he really liked it or not, but I opened it and I began. It was the tale of Sir Ethelred on a quest for a magic shield that would protect him from all harm. It began with Sir Ethelred riding through a storm, such as was going on that very night, and he was so wet and cold he came at last to a hermitage, one that he had visited before, but he knew the hermit was curmudgeonly and not welcoming, having no charity or love for pilgrims, let alone knights on a quest. He could see a light under the door, so Ethelred knocked hard and loud, but the hermit did not answer. Angry, Ethelred pulled out his mace and began to slam at the door again and again until the wood splintered. And strange to say, as I read this, I thought I heard somewhere wood splintering and cracking. It must have been just a beam somewhere giving way at the pulling and tugging of the wind. I reckoned in the morning we would find some part of the roof blown down and water running down a wall. I read on. When Ethelred entered the hermit's cell, he saw not what he expected, a dark place with maybe a candle and a place of prayer and an angry hermit. But this was a huge cave filled with gold and silver and jewels, and on it all sat a huge dragon. It had big red eyes and a writhing neck, and it spat and it hissed, and its neck came closer and closer, and its eyes glared at Ethelred, hissing and grinding its teeth. Ethelred stepped back and drew his sword. The dragon spat and clawed and tried to bite Ethelred, but he swung his sword left and right, up and down, piercing and slicing, until he had wounded the beast, and purple blood dripped over the gold and silver, melting the metal, which hissed and pooled in this poisonous steam. And at last the dragon screeched and screamed. But at that moment I heard a ghastly, screeching, metallic, screaming noise, and it was way down below my room. I looked up at Roderick. Had he heard it? He was staring manic and wide-eyed at the wall, but he gave no indication that he had heard. Once again I put it down to the storm and my imagination, and I read on how Ethelred climbed the pile of gold and silver to make sure the dragon was dead, and he sliced off the head, which bounced down and fell at the bottom of the heap. And then sliding and slipping, he made his way up that mountain of gold and silver, and at the top, to his amazement, he saw the magic shield, which was the point of his whole quest. He reached out to grab it from the wall, and it fell with a clattering sound onto the floor, at which point Roderick jumped up, wide-eyed. He leaned forward and grabbed me and shook me and said, "That story is prophetic." "What do you mean?" I said, laying the book aside. And he said, It's dreadful because I've got to tell you. I couldn't tell you before, but we laid Madeline alive in her tomb." I leapt to my feet. "Then we must go and help her, now." And Roderick shook his head and said, No, it's too late." "How did you know? When did you know?" And Roderick stared distracted at the ceiling, and wringing his hands, he said, "I knew the day after. I could hear her. I could hear her calling to me, begging me to let her free." "Why didn't you say something, man?" "I couldn't," said Roderick. "The house wouldn't let me." And when you read that story about the door splintering, did you not hear the wood of her coffin splintering? She must have rocked it onto the floor and smashed it open. And when you spoke of the screaming, screeching of the dragon dying, that was her pushing the ironclad door wide. And when you spoke of Ethelred climbing the stair of the gold and silver, that is her. She is even at the door now." And as he spoke, the door pushed open, and in the wan light from the fire, there stood Madeline, cadaverous, her fingers bleeding from where she had scratched at the coffin lid, her white gown besmirched with blood. Shaking and weeping, she staggered forward. She held out her arms to Roderick. He stood to greet her. "Madeline," he said, "I'm so sorry." And she stumbled and fell into his arms, but he was so weak and feeble, he fell backwards and hit his head on the corner of the hearth. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Blood oozed from his ears and his eyes. I knew he was dead. I lifted the Lady Madeline off his corpse, but she too was staring blankly and not breathing. I knew she was dead at last. I did not hesitate. I pulled on my boots and my cloak. I ran from that room, down the steps, out of the main door, across the courtyard to the stable. I grabbed the first horse I saw. I mounted it bareback, galloped across the courtyard, out of the gate and across the causeway. And as I did, I heard the most almighty cracking and screeching and grinding of stone and glass shattering. And then suddenly my whole path was bathed in blood-red light. I gave my horse its head as it galloped on, and I turned back, and I saw that tiny crack I'd seen that first day was now splitting open, and the setting moon was blood-red and casting gory light through the building and ahead of me, over the tarn and up the hill on the far side. The horse ran and ran and ran, and once we were on safe ground, I turned and watched in horror as the house fell, stone and rafter and roof and turret and arch, grinding and crashing into the tarn, which rose with great black waves as if pulling the stone down into its dark depths. And then the waters settled over it. The moon set, and in the still darkness, luminous grey wraiths rose out from the waters and danced in triumph. Thank you for listening.